Welcome everybody to our webinar today. We're going to talk about the better way to manage property, plant, and equipment leases, or PP&E leases, in D365 Finance and Operations. My name is Neil MacDonald. I'm with Binary Stream Software. Let's jump into D365 Finance and Operations. And here is my D365 dashboard. And this is the property group's homepage. They're going to come in and see their D365. If you look at the module list, there's actually a few modules here that Binary Stream has created. One of our other products is our subscription billing suite, which is the advanced recurring contract billing, advanced revenue expense deferrals. That's another webinar. But if I keep scrolling down, you'll find we have a Property Lease Management module. This is what we're going to focus on today. So let's jump in. I don't want to spend a lot of time in the setup, but there's a couple things here that are really important. We talked about the charges, the multiple levels, the different categories. They're found in the Property Lease Management setup parameters. Let's jump in there very quickly. You'll notice under the general section here that we can do both revenue leases, and on the revenue side, we can do free text or sales orders. We can also do expense leases, again, using an invoice journal or a vendor invoice. Now, I've got both of mine set up to use either the free text or the invoice journal because I don't want to have to deal with items. We give you the other documents. If you want to use items, if you want to use the purchase order and the sales orders, you're certainly welcome to do that. We built the system to do either one. When we're going through and setting up the different document types, for example, if I'm on the revenue side, we've given you some options here about what we do with these documents as well. Do we want to automatically create them? Do we want to create them and automatically post them? If you don't have to pick, pack, and ship, you may want to just post right through as opposed to two steps. So we've tried to make life very, very easy for you. We've also said, you know, we've got different unit areas. Most customers are using square footage. There's different units available there, of course, that you can use. We can consolidate multiple invoices for one customer, multiple properties. We can do period by period leases. We have the ability to validate occupancy. You know, we've got a default frequency. You notice we have monthly, weekly, quarterly, annually, one time. So we can set up the leases for different billing frequencies. Over on this side, under the ASC 842, we can choose, are we focused on ASC 842 or IFRS 16? We're going to focus on the 842 side today. We can decide whether by default, when I create a lease, and I can change this on the fly, is it an operating lease or is it a financial lease? Now, that's the default. If I say, you know, most of my leases are financial leases, I would set it up there, but I get the odd operating lease, I can change it as I create a lease. The short-term lease simply says, you know, under ASC 842 and IFRS 16, if a lease has less than 12 months with no terms that you expect to renew, you don't have to read 842 at all. There's no balance sheet presentation required. We can still put the lease in our system, we can still manage it for you, but there is no balance sheet presentation. We have the start date. The start date is what day am I adopting the standard? Some customers may have adopted already. We would simply go in and set this date when we do the implementation to whatever that date was. But then we've got a reporting start date. I typically recommend to put this to 2 years prior to the start date. If a lease was in existence prior to that date, we will build the amortization table for the right of use asset and the lease liability back to the reporting start date. Well, why would I want to do that? One of the adoption methods under ASC 842 is 2 years of retrospective reporting. So if I adopt on January 1st of 2020, when I produce my 2020 financials, I have to restate, not refile, but just simply restate for visibility purposes, what would 2019 have looked like had I had ASC 842 in place? What would 2018 have looked like? So I have 3 years of very referenceable data, so I can quickly look at my financial statements and say, I'm in 2020, I've adopted, here's what the last 2 years would have looked like. And we will continue to do that. Now, that's just one of the adoption methods. The other one is just a modified method where we can simply make a change to retain earnings, but you still have to put full disclosure. You know, you have to change what's the change in your financial statement? What does it look like? Where do you have those liabilities and those assets? And then you have to explain that in great detail in your disclosures. Well, again, if you have the reports that we're going to create for you, it makes creating those disclosures much easier. So that's the basic setup. Now, we talked about lease categories. Here, I've got a few lease categories, and you can create as many of these as you want. So, for example, I've got an equipment lease. Now, remember I talked about multi-level. In the case of my equipment, I'm saying there are no additional levels. I'm saying it's none. So there are no labels required. but I have, for example, a hospital, and I want to go right down to the room or the unit level. So I'm going to say I want to report on 3 levels. I've got the hospital itself, I've got the wing of the hospital, and then I've got the unit or the room in the hospital. Notice we can also change the labels as to who are we leasing from or who are we leasing to. In the case of a hospital, I'm going to call that person a patient. In the case of a piece of equipment, it's just the lessee, lessor. So again, we've made the system to be very flexible, and these labels will change based on what you're looking at. The long-term care home, they actually lease right down to the bed level, right? They may have a unit with multiple beds, and that senior, that long-term care person is renting not the entire room, but their monthly fee is paying for just the bed. So at this point, we may want to have 3 levels and have the facility, the unit, right down to the bed. And in this case, they're not necessarily a patient, they're a resident, right? So again, the system is designed to be very flexible. We're going to look at this in more detail when we get into actually creating the leases. A couple other pieces available here is to set up the deposits. I can create both deposits payable and deposits receivable. I can set up meter functionality, so power meters, electric meters, water meters. If you have a meter inside of the telcos or the utilities meters where you're splitting off for your tenants, you may want to track that. We have different terms. So in my case, I've got monthly, I've got 1 year, 10 year, 3 year, 5 year. You create as many of these again as you want. And then for a termination section, you want to create some termination codes. So we've looked at the basic setup. Now, let's go to this categories area and take it one step further. We're going to come in and actually build out our properties. So if I come into the property area, so here, for example, in my equipment, there's really nothing to create. Remember, there's no levels there. So there's nothing else to create. It's just a piece of equipment. Let's go back one. Let's go to the vehicle. Now, I've said the vehicle has 1 level. In this case, I'm going to just simply put in the type of vehicle, and then I'm going to start adding the charges to that. If I look at the hospital, for example, let's come down here. If I look at my hospital, notice I have in my system 2 different hospitals. Those hospitals have wings. When I'm on the general hospital, I see the east, north, south, west wing that belong to that hospital. Notice if I click to the Grace Hospital, I don't see those other wings. I'm seeing the wings now that belong to the Grace Hospital. We're actually tracking each, in this case, the hospital and the wings. If I go down and look at the actual units, I'm on the Adler wing, therefore I see all of the Adler rooms, A310, 410, 510. If I go to the Mercer wing, I'm now seeing the M's. So again, the system is designed to minimize the setup. There's some complexity in there, yes, because we have to look at what structure your leases have. But once we build those in, we want it to be as easy as possible. Notice now, for example, if I come to add a new line, I'm on the Grace Hospital, the Mercer wing. If I go to add a new line, the only things that I can add here are the ones that belong to that hospital. It's not even letting me find anymore because the Adler and Mercer wings are the only 2 that belong to that hospital. So again, the data is restricted to what you need to see. Let's go back to our properties again. We can do the same thing if I come into my malls or my long-term care homes. I've got both of those in here. Let's look at the long-term care. Again, the same kind of thing. I've got my 2 different facilities. I've got different units, and I've got the different beds. So depending upon which unit I'm on, those are the beds that I see. So again, the system is designed to be flexible. We're going to create the charges. We have to be able to go in and add charges to our customers. So again, this is some of the master record that needs to be set up in order to build a lease. Let's look at both the receivables and the payables side. Here's one, for example, the AP common area maintenance. I may have to pay a portion of common area maintenance to my landlord every month. So I'm going to create that charge, and I'm simply going to say, it's called AP CAM. It has a charge account. If I wanted to tie it back to an item in the release products, this is where I would do that. Because I'm using the free text invoice in the invoice journal, I don't need to do that in my case. Now, I also have to look at, especially on the accounts payable side of it, the payables, is this an ASC 842 lease component? Under ASC 842, we have to look at every charge and decide, is it a lease component or not? Basically, if it is an integral part of the lease, it's a lease component. If it has a standalone value outside of that, then it would not. So it would not be a lease component. CAM, all the documents, all the literature tells you that CAM has a standalone value. It is never a lease component. However, the actual lease charge itself, yes, it's a lease component. The minute we turn this on, that opens up this section where we key in all of the GL accounts that are required to manage this lease under ASC 842. Again, whether we're on the receivables or the payables side, we would have these GL accounts to work with. We come down again, my lease charge for a vehicle would also be a lease component, and so on. If I come down to the revenue side, my miscellaneous charge is not a lease component. Things like changing the locks, charging for new keys, that kind of thing. Those have standalone value. They're not lease components. However, my rent would in fact be a lease component, so I could come in here and turn it on and add that. Now, this will come into play more for IFRS 16. We're still in the process of building some of that functionality. Our largest focus to date has been on the ASC 842 side of things. So we've got our charges built. Of course, we want to, if we have to use CPI schedules, we can set those up. The CPI schedules are based on either an index or a percentage. I have one of each. This one is based on using an index, as you can see. If I go to the percentage, it's now ignoring the index side and will increase the payment based on a percentage. We're going to set up a rate schedule as well if needed. Again, these are not mandatory. In this case, you may have a lease that says, you have an annual payment of, in this case, $185, but you may pay it monthly or quarterly. Well, we're going to set up the annual schedule. When we attach it to the lease and tell it what the payment frequency is, it does the math for us. It would take, for example, that $185 and divide it by 12 months if we're paying monthly, divided by 4 if we're paying quarterly. It manages that. We may have a charge that's based on a cost per square foot. For example, in this one, I've got a monthly payment of $125, $130, $135 per square foot. And again, all of those units of measure are available. If you work in meters, if you want to work in yards, whatever that is, it's all available there. So that's a lot of the boring stuff. That's the setup. It's very important it's done correctly. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time there. But now let's go and actually look at some leases. I'm going to jump into this all leases area. And notice I've only got a handful of leases here. We've got customers that have just a few, up to hundreds, even thousands of leases. We've been running this product in Dynamics GP for about 10, 12 years now, relatively new in F&O. So let's look at a couple examples here. Let's look at lease number 3. This is a long-term care home. So remember we said that long-term care home actually had 3 different levels, right? So we've got our facility, our unit, and our bed all listed here, and then we're going to add the charges. First thing we're going to do, though, is come up and decide, is this a revenue lease or an expense lease? You simply check off which one it is, and then all of the relevant logic in behind kicks in to make sure that we're managing the lease properly. In this case, it is a revenue lease. I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to select the category. I'm going to select my resident, put in all my relevant dates. I would get a term. This is a 5-year term, and they want 45-day lead time with an email to the family. You can create a report that would pop that out for you. Now let's collapse the lease term. Notice again, we have the facility, the unit, and the bed. So again, I can open this up. The facility, I can select the one I want. Inside of Shady Pines, I'm only seeing the units that belong to Shady Pines. Notice if I want to add another line, again, the only ones I can see are the ones that belong to that particular facility or that particular unit, right down to the bed level. At the lowest level, in this case, it's the bed, I'm going to start attaching my charges. Let's just collapse these up. There's my charge. I've got a rent charge. It's going to be billed monthly. I've got an amount of $850. It may or may not be taxable. In this case, I believe this one I had taxable. We jump in and look at the billing lines. We're going to build out what that future flow looks like. So when it comes to doing your forecasting, what am I going to collect next month, next quarter, next year, 5 years, 10 years, whatever. This is a 5-year lease. So we built the schedule out actually, you can see if we go through all 5 years. But notice the numbers are changing here. It started out at 850 because we've got an escalation that we can create here based on either a comparison. In my case, I've got the lesser of either 10% or $80. I could also build it based on a CPI schedule, based on a rate schedule, and I can access those here to update them and manage them. In this case, it's looking at the lesser of 10% or $80. Notice my payment goes to $850. My escalation starts 1 year from today. So if we go to that date, there we see it doing the increase. In this case, it's picked up the $80. We keep going, it's done it again, and so on and so on. So again, that forecasting, that ability to look into the future and see what does our future look like from either a revenue or an expense standpoint, the heavy lifting is all done here. Now, the other thing that you'll notice is as we create that document, we're tracking it here. So it says, yes, this one has been billed. Notice these aren't checked. They're not billed yet. There's no information. But if I wanted to drill in and look at that invoice, I can, from here, I can drill it, I can open it up, I can go look at the voucher, and I can see where, yes, this was taxable. I can see the taxes there. There's my accounts receivable, 903.13, and my rent expense, or my rent revenue, sorry, in this case, is $850. I can very quickly see it. So again, we're managing all of that real time. The minute I create that invoice, if somebody else was to go in and run a report, that revenue has hit the revenue. That accounts payable has hit the age trial balance. Everything is happening real time. It's not out there somewhere. There's no need to figure out how do I integrate it? How do I make these systems talk to each other? By being an integrated module, that's all done for you. If we needed to change something, we could add more charges here. We could come back into the lease. We could add another charge. You know, maybe you have to charge them for a one-time charge to change the keys, something like that. That's simple to do. We can simply come in and say, you know, we want to add a line. We're going to add a charge. Sorry, in here, we're going to add the charge. Let's say it's a miscellaneous charge. It's not tied to an item, so I don't need that. I'm going to charge this. It's going to be a one-time to change the keys. I'm going to do an each on here. And I'm going to say, you know, we changed all the keys, so it's $250. And I can come in if I want, go into the billing lines and tell it which one I want to put in. It's giving me a hard time on the item number. That's kind of weird. Let's just remove that line for now. So we simply add the new item in there, and we just add the charge. We also have a utility that allows us to mass import those miscellaneous charges as well. Now, let's go back out and let's look at an expense lease. On the expense side of things, and this is where the ASC 842 really comes into play. So I got a couple different ones we can look at here. We actually have an equipment lease. This one is a single level. I mean, there are no additional levels here. You know, I'm saying it's a piece of equipment. Therefore, that's the category. Therefore, it says, well, just tell me the charge. I don't have those three levels I have to deal with. I come in here and I'm going to set it up again. I've got my charge. There's one at $747.50. I come into my billing lines. And again, it builds out what does that schedule look like. I've got this one already invoiced. It's pushed to the invoice. I haven't finished processing it, but it's there. Now, notice this new section here. This is the ASC 842 function. In here, this allows me to come in and tell the system what this lease looks like and how it should appear on the balance sheet. So I'm going to come in, and if there were any direct costs or incentives, I could put them in here. Under the ASC 842 and the IFRS 16 documentation, the net present value calculation, that right of use asset and lease liability, are the net present value of all future payments plus any guaranteed residuals, plus any direct costs incurred in creating the lease, less any tenant incentives. And we arrive at that right of use asset value and the lease liability. And we simply come in and the system builds that out, and it shows the net present value here. It's showing all the details that we need to look at, and then it builds out that amortization table. So in this case, we're paying, this one's easy. It's a straight line, $747.50. Our lease expense is therefore straight line. This stays exactly the same. And then using the interest method, we're amortizing that right of use asset, and at the end of each period, showing the balance of each. You can very quickly print this out. We have some reports that show this. Now, when you set this up, you click on the initial journal entry process. Down here, we have an audit trail. It shows where it created it. We can drill into that actual journal entry number. We can see it, and if we look at the lines, it has created here the right of use asset, the lease liability, and it's ready to go. Now, we take it one step further. When you create the invoices, we manage all of the functionality behind there as well. We manage the right of use asset and the lease liability. For example, if I drill in and look at the lines on that invoice, you will see we have, I clicked the wrong one, sorry, that's the right of use asset, lease liability. I clicked the wrong spot. I want to come back and look at the invoice, sorry. The billing lines, look at the invoice journal. This is where I was going. So again, we can come in here, look at the lines, and you'll see that not only are we managing the accounts payable, we're managing the right of use asset, the lease liability, the interest component. All of that is being managed, right? There's your 842 lease liability being reduced. Now it's going to increase by the interest component. Again, if you follow through the examples in the 842 documentation, we have the accounts payable to our supplier, we have the lease expense, and then we have the amortization of the right of use asset. So all of this is happening behind the scenes. There's no need, again, to take this information, go out to Excel, and create this complex amortization table. We're managing it for you. Let's go back and look at one more lease. I'm going to come back and look at one that's got a little more complexity. Again, we have an expense lease. This is the hospital. And again, in this case, again, we're going to have our three levels. So we have the hospital, we have the wing, we have the unit. Underneath that, we then start adding the charges. I will point out here, you may have noticed just before I close that up, we do have the ability to show also the dimensions. So you can create your own financial dimensions. Our next release, or shortly thereafter, we are adding financial dimensions at each of these three levels as well. So you'll be able to have financial dimensions that will allow you to drill in and really slice and dice your data. Again, I'm coming down to my charges. I've added my charge in here. I go to my billing lines. Again, I can see in this case, this is one again where I do have an escalation. So this one's going to be a little more complex. You notice we go from 850, we're going up and it's increasing over time. Therefore, when we drill into the ASC 842, you'll notice that even though we're paying $937.13, our lease expense is actually $1510.05. So we have to manage that throughout the life of the lease. This would be much more complex to build out in Excel. Because it's an operating lease, it's straight lined, the lease expense is straight lined over the life of the lease. As the payment increases, that straight line, you'll notice that change carrying on there. Now, if there's a change in the lease, we have the ability, and I did change something partway through there, we can come up here and remeasure if something changes. That's actually very important. There are certain times when you make a change under 842 or IFRS 16 where you have to remeasure the right of use asset and the lease liability, and we've got the ability to do that using the remeasure button. Now, those were both operating leases we looked at. We also have a finance lease. Again, when we set up the finance lease, we're simply going to tell it that it is a financial lease. Again, we're going to set the lease up, all the details all the way through, set up our charges, and again, we drill in, and we can see, again, we're setting up that amortization, that future payment table, the amortization table. You'll notice this one looks a little bit different. The amortization of the right of use asset is straight line, whereas the lease liability of the lease expense is not. It's based on the principal and interest method. So we're handling both operating and finance leases, again, depending upon what your circumstances are. So some of the other things that we need to do, we've got all of our leases built. Great, we're ready to go. Periodically, we're going to come into the periodic task and run the invoice creator. So we can do this whether we're doing revenues or expenses. So let's say I'm the accounts payable person. I want to run my invoices. Again, I can choose, do I want an invoice journal or a vendor invoice? I'm going to use the invoice journal. That's why I was looking for the item. I changed that in the setup, forgot to change it back. I can come in here and say, I want to run my invoices for the month of February. This is a sample database. My billing's a little behind. I can put whatever date I want on the document as well. So maybe on February 1st, I want to bill everything up to February 29th. If you leave the from date open, it will look and make sure nothing got missed since the last time you ran the invoices. If I wanted to force it to only bill February, it would do that. Where leaving this open comes in handy is if you pay in advance or if you collect in advance or invoice in advance and somebody adds a new service for a period that's already been invoiced, you want to make sure that you catch that. In any case, I'm going to come up here, click on the select button. It's going to give me some selection criteria. I can come in and filter this by lease number, status, customer, and so on. We may have a customer that comes in and says, we're going to be out next month. Would you do me a favor, send me the invoice early, whether it's a payable or receivable. I can come in and filter it just to that customer, just to that lease, and get that processed and leave everything else. I'm going to click OK. It's going to find what matches that criteria. Notice I've got my multiple leases here ready to go. At this point, click OK, click batch, whichever one I prefer, and the invoicing will automatically happen. We're not going to do that because it takes a moment and nobody wants to watch invoices run. But then it will go back to those leases as we saw and stamp in that, yes, it's been billed. Here's the document number, and it will process that. I can do the exact same thing on the revenue side. I was looking at expenses. On the revenue side, again, the same thing, free text or sales order, and put in the information. It'll go through, again, it'll pull that information for me. Again, under the periodic tasks, we do have a lease modification processing. So that remeasure button that we talked about earlier would actually bring up this utility. This utility allows me to remeasure the lease liability or the right of use asset. There are times maybe you've added a new term, maybe you've extended a lease. In the case of an IFRS 16 lease, perhaps there's a variable component that's now been changed. Those things require restating the right of use asset, the lease liability, and pushing that off into a gain or a loss on operations. In the case of ASC 842, that's taken into account as a variable component. That's a whole other set of conversations there as to which one's right. We might want to update the lease component accounts. Maybe we want to change the accounts. Maybe we're transferring a lease from one department to another, one company to another. We may want to mark a charge as a lease component. It may be that we thought a charge was a non-lease component and we set it up that way. The auditors come in and say, sorry, you're mistaken. That actually is a lease component. I can come in and I can modify that. Again, I can create those initial journal entries for the ASC 842. This is how we would do it if we were setting the system up for you from scratch. Nobody's ever bought a piece of software so they can start business tomorrow, right? So people that are looking at this product already have leases. They've got them sitting in Excel. They've got them in some other system. They've got to figure out, how do I get them out of there into here? And if I've got 500 leases, do I have to manually build 500 leases, manually going to create those 500 journal entries? Absolutely not. We would use this to create the initial journal entries across all those 500 leases and help you get the ASC 842 IFRS 16 setup done. We do have a process that we call stubbing. Again, suppose we bring in your leases, 500 leases. Some of them go back a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, but you've already done all your invoicing up to the end of last month. Well, we bring in the lease all the way back from day one, and then we stub it. That's what we call that process of stubbing. We simply pick the date and say, you've already gone to this point. We'll stub it. You can see what happened in our system, but we don't accidentally rebill or re-recognize something. It's already done. And if we did one by mistake, we can unstub it. Now, let's go back to this bringing things in and creating that initial journal entry. I'm going to kind of jump over here just into the data management. One thing I will point out is to set this system up, we have already come into the data management area. And if you're familiar with this, this is the area in F&O that's used to hook up to a front-end system. If you're using a CRM, CE, Salesforce, something like that, where your sales guys are out working in that, maybe your property managers are working in that, and you want to be able to push information in. It might simply be something as simple as, I've got a bunch of Excel spreadsheets. I don't have a front end, but I've got an Excel spreadsheet with all my lease information in it. We can use this to import or export that data, whether it's automatic through the APIs, the data entities, or whether it's through a spreadsheet. But if you notice, we click on the data entities, these are all of the out of the box, and there's hundreds. You can scroll through this for days. This is what's out of the box. If I filter this to PLM, Property Lease Management, this brings up the data entities that we have created here at Binary Stream. Notice we can bring in your properties. We can bring in the individual levels. We can bring in those categories, the charges, all the CPI information. We can bring in all the lease information. We can bring in the terms, the meters, the meter reads, and so on. So we've already built these, and as we add new features and new components and new modules, we will be updating these data entities as well to keep them up to date, to make entering information into the system that much easier for you, the user. Again, let's come back to our periodic tasks. We have a mass one-time charge utility. You watch me create or start to create. Because of my setup, obviously it didn't work for me perfectly, but rather than manually adding a one-time charge, I can come in here and add a one-time charge to all my leases. And we're in the process of building the data entity and the import capability for this. But suppose, for example, on the revenue side, my tenants I had to replace all the keys. So I can create a miscellaneous charge of $250. And I can say, I did that this week, so I'll put this week on it. I can select. It's going to say, okay, which leases, I can pick, for example, which property, which category, and so on. I click OK. It says there, all of these. So I can now select the ones I want. I click the process or the OK button in the lower right corner. This will now add a miscellaneous charge to each of these leases, properties, units in the amount of $250 based on this date. And then when I run my invoices for the month of June, this charge will be looked after as well. Again, whether it's revenue or expense. Think of a situation where this module would come in handy. On the GP side, I talked to a customer many years ago who was running long-term care homes, and they had several long-term care homes, on average about 300 residents. Well, the rent for those residents covered their bed and their meals, but it didn't cover things like when the grandkids came and stayed for an extra meal. It didn't cover the hair care or the physiotherapy or all of those other one-time charges, charges at the canteen. So they had a bunch of point of sale systems that would capture all that data. And then they were thinking, oh, now we've got Average 300 residents, average 5 homes, that's 1,500 residents at an average of 3, 4, 5 charges each. Now we've got thousands of these miscellaneous charges. How do we get them in? Well, we use the mass one-time charge, import them all in. Everything is done quickly and easily and accurately because it's just taking from your point of sale system, whatever that download is. Now, you may have noticed as you're looking at this, there's a bunch of wizards in here as well. There's a new lease wizard, setting up a lease. There's a lot of areas where things could go wrong. You know, if I'm trying to do it from scratch and I'm brand new in the system, wouldn't it be nice to have the system walk me through step by step by step to make sure I didn't miss anything? That's the new lease wizard. What about when somebody moves out? I want to make sure that I've moved them out properly. I've terminated the lease. I've gotten rid of all those future charges, whether it's revenues or expenses, so I'm not misstating my financial statements. I also want to make that unit available to rent again, especially if I want to collect rent on it. I have to free it up from a vacancy perspective. There's also a space change wizard. Again, this is one that the long-term care folks really liked because you could have a situation where maybe you've got a couple, again, we're thinking seniors, they're sharing a room, you're leasing a bed to each one of them. It could even be a single lease with the 2 beds on it. Unfortunately, life happens, one passes away, they want to move that person from a double room to a single room, the survivor. The space change wizard is an easy way to do that. It's simply, without having to totally terminate the lease and totally recreate it, you can simply move a person from one space, that lowest level, to the next. Same thing could happen in the mall. You know, maybe you've got a coffee shop and they're going to move from one location to another, the cell phones, one spot to another, and so on. And then there's a renew lease wizard. Maybe a lease was set up with a specific term. At the end of it, the tenant, or maybe you as the tenant, have decided to renew the lease and to carry it on. That's the renew lease wizard. So again, a lot of functionality built in. Now, we also talked about the visibility in our portfolio, doing some reporting. Now, again, this is a very new sample database, so the reports I have don't have a ton of data, but you'll notice here under inquiries and reports, there is a bunch of inquiries. These are just kind of quick hits. We'll show it on the screen. Probably one of the most important here is the lease disclosures, especially under ASC 842. If you look at the 842 documentation, page 121, there's a sample disclosure. There's a lot of information that's required on your disclosures for under ASC 842 that were not required prior. So we've got a report that would help with that. We also have a bunch of SSRS reports. What I'm going to do, rather than run these reports, because sometimes they might take a moment, I'm going to flip back to the PowerPoint just for a moment and run through and show you what some of these reports look like. Here's the property list report. Again, I don't have a lot of data in here, as you can see, but you can see that we're looking at the facility, the unit, the bed, all the way down through, just a list of properties. That's all it is. You know, what have I got available? My property analysis reports, again, I'm looking at my square footage or my square meters, whatever it happens to be. I've got the lease information, you know, is it vacant or is it occupied? If it's occupied, you know, when was the start date? Is there, when is the expiry on this? If that information is in here, if it's a month to month, of course, there won't be an expiry. But again, we're showing a lot of information. We're showing our occupancy versus our vacancy. We've got a lease list report. This just simply lists the leases that are available. And again, I ran these reports quite early in setting up my sample database. But again, I can see my lease. I can see some basic information. For example, you know, the facility, the unit. I can see which tenant it is. I can see the dates. I can see the square footage if that's required. This again is a long-term care, so it's not going to have that. And I can see the amount that's being billed. The lease summary report. This in one spot lets me see a whole bunch of stuff. I can see, do I have a deposit on file? What was the amount? What was remaining? You know, what is the term? And if there's multiple terms, they would all be listed here. If there's multiple deposits, they'll be listed here. And I can see all the details of the lease as well. Again, the chart is almost like a little mini rent roll here as well. Speaking of rent rolls, we actually have one of those as well. So again, we're looking at each of the charges. You know, what is the current amount? What's the previous amount? So here, the previous or the current is $850. When it rolls, it's going to go to, in this case, it's staying the same, the $850. I've got to annualize. If there's escalations built in, those will be taken into account as well. We have a forecast report. We can very quickly run this and see, you know, if it's in blue, I've got mine color coded blue or yellow. If it's blue, it means I've already run the invoice, whether it's a revenue or expense. I've already processed it. It's out of the way. But, you know, if I want to very quickly look at, you know, for a particular building, a particular lease, a particular customer, what is my revenue or expense going to be next month, next quarter, next year? I can set the report up, put in whatever dates I want, start or end dates, and it will process this report. Now, we can see very easily. And then of course, it also drops it down to, it shows different subtotals as well. Again, a very, very new report, but we can see how it's going to make life a lot easier going forward. We can also see on the end here, there is an escalation in this case going from 850 to 930. We can quickly see that. And again, this is the list of the other reports. Again, feel free to reach out to me, neil@binarystream.com. If you want to talk pricing, if you want to talk about implementation, how quickly can my customers or can I myself have this in and be up and ready, because we know that the deadline for ASC 842 is coming, send a note to sales@binarystream.com. And thank you everybody for your time today, and hopefully we can help you with your PP&E leases in D365 F&O. Thank you.